Hi, it's Jim Miller. I'm with you again as we continue in our series on the book of Acts in the Bible. We are in week number 5 now. We have gone through quite a bit of the book of Acts, quite a bit of history building up to what's now going to be an accelerated study because we got to get through to the end of the book. We're in week 5, so here again is the brief summary of what we have seen so far. Acts chapter 1. Jesus commissions his disciples. They talk to him about the kingdom. He has a bigger plan for them, and then he ascends into heaven. Acts chapter 2, the event of Pentecost. The Holy Spirit comes on the church, and suddenly they are empowered in supernatural and miraculous ways to go and do the work of ministry. Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47 is that beautiful little picture of what the early church was and how it functioned. Churches ever since then have gone back to that little passage and said, who should we as followers of Jesus be? What should we do? What should our community look like? And that's Acts chapter 2. It paints this beautiful picture of the Christian community that Christians ever since then have tried to emulate. Acts chapter 3 and 4 then fleshes out the story of the early church and what was going on. So we see they were gathering for discipleship. They were studying the gospel, the teachings of the apostles. They were gathering for fellowship every day. They were breaking bread in their homes and with glad and sincere hearts, sharing their life together. They were sharing their goods and resources. Anybody who had anything sold it and gave the money to care for those who didn't have as much. There was just an outpouring of generosity and altruism and sort of an open-handedness about the world. They didn't believe that they needed to cling to this world because suddenly they had seen the kingdom of heaven coming, and they were going to be citizens of a new kingdom. They were going to live by the principles of the kingdom of heaven and not by the principles of this world. So they no longer clung to their money and their goods. As a result, signs and wonders were practiced throughout the church. They were witnessing the healing of the sick, and the gospel was being spread through signs and wonders. At one point, we see that the church has grown to 3,000 people. Soon thereafter, we see it's grown to 5,000 people. And persecution breaks out. As this takes off and spreads, other people become jealous of the popularity that Christians are enjoying, of the rapid spread of this movement, and it's begun to be seen as a threat, first to the Jewish state, and before too long to the Romans as well. The Romans who had crucified Jesus are now going to see this as a threat to their empire as well. So that's the first 4 chapters. Chapter 5, we looked at the story of Ananias and Sapphira, and that's sort of that tricky and challenging passage about people who lied for unclear reasons. It wasn't clear what Ananias and Sapphira thought they were going to get out of it, but they dropped dead, and that was sort of this frightening show of the power of God in the early church. Well, now we're going to get into 6 and 7, and we're going to get through those 2 chapters, and we're going to look at Stephen, Saul, Simon, and Philip. We're going to look at 4 guys. Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Saul, who will become the main character of the book. Saul will convert in chapter 8, and then we'll follow the stories. He changes his name to Paul, and we'll follow him the rest of the book. Stephen, Saul, Simon, who shows up and is sort of an interesting look into the supernatural in a bad way, in a dark way. And then the one non-S name in this week's class, we're going to look at Philip. There's an interesting little story about Philip, one of the disciples of Jesus, and it has significance for how the church viewed itself. And it's been a story that's often referenced that we should look at, make sure that's part of our study. Then after that, we're going to get into the life of Paul. And after that, all the rest of the book is the life of Paul. So we're going to wrap up the pre-Pauline part of the book of Acts today in Acts chapter 6 and 7. Let me read to you a little section from Acts chapter 6, starting at verse 8, and we're going to read the story of Stephen. We're going to read part of the story of Stephen. Acts chapter 6 at verse 8. Now Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, performed great wonders and signs among the people. So he was known for having the power to heal the sick. That's what was spreading the Christian movement early on. It wasn't that they had great potluck dinners. It wasn't that they had the best band in town. It wasn't even that they had a really powerful message. It was that people were being healed. And when that goes on in your church grows. And so Stephen was known for being in touch with the Holy Spirit and for God's grace working through him and healing the sick. Opposition arose, however, from members of the Synagogue of the Freedmen, as it was called. Jews of Cyrene and Alexandria, as well as the provinces of Cilicia and Asia, who began to argue with Stephen. We're going to come back to that. You can mark that, underline that. We need to talk about who this is. But they could not stand up against the wisdom the Spirit gave him as he spoke. So Stephen is supernaturally empowered by the Holy Spirit to have the right words to say in these debates with this other group. Then they secretly persuaded some men to say, "We have heard Stephen speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God." So they accuse Stephen falsely of saying bad things about the Jewish faith, or distorting or misleading the Jewish people. Bear in mind, there was no separation of church and state. The nation of Judea was ruled over by the Jewish law, which was in the Jewish scriptures, which was based on the law of God. So bear in mind, when they say Stephen is saying blasphemous things about Moses and the temple, they mean Stephen is a threat to the state. So they mean to slander him and say he is a traitor and he is a danger to the powers that be. Once that happens, once you're branded with that, that will start a chain of events that will lead to you being treated as an enemy of the state. And that's what they mean to do. They're not just merely having a theological conversation about the kind of things that Stephen is teaching. They want to say he's a political threat and he's a criminal, so they can provoke a legal reaction to him. So they stirred up the people and the elders and the teachers of the law. They seized Stephen and brought him before the Sanhedrin, which, remember, is the Jewish Supreme Court. It's not just a theological body, it's a political body. They make decisions about whether or not God's law has been broken. They brought him before the Sanhedrin. They produced false witnesses who testified, "This fellow never stopped speaking against this holy place," meaning the temple, "and against the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down to us." Remember, Jesus said, "Tear this temple down and I will build it again in 3 days." And the gospel writers interpret that and say he was talking about his body. He was talking about the fact that he would die and be buried and rise from the dead. That's what he meant. But the people listening said, "Oh, he said tear down the temple." He's threatening the Jewish temple. He means to bring a rebellion to Jerusalem. So he's a threat to the state, which is why the Jewish people could convince the Romans to crucify him. So now they're trying to brand Stephen with the same thing. All who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at Stephen, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel. Right? There was something about Stephen. That actually harkens back to the stories of Moses in the Old Testament. And it said that after Moses had been with God, his face was glowing, that somehow he appeared different. Okay, there's 4 things to call attention to in this little interaction between Stephen and his accusers. First of all, don't forget that what's on the line that's making Stephen popular, that's making the early Christians popular, is signs and wonders. The word of them is spreading because the sick are being healed. It's something Jesus did. It's something Jesus taught his disciples to do. And then Jesus sent his disciples out, and he said, "Wherever you go, heal the sick, cast out demons, and preach good news to the poor." Jesus, at the end of his life, in Matthew 28, commissions his disciples. And he says, "Go and teach them everything I have commanded you." And what he commanded them was, heal the sick, cast out demons, preach good news to the poor. The commission to the early church was keep doing the things that I'm doing. And that's what the disciples did. And the disciples were then commissioned by Jesus to teach other people to do the same things. There was to be an unbroken line of the continuation of the practices that Jesus did. At parts of world history along the way, that has gotten lost. At various times in the history of the Christian church, this has gotten lost, especially in the post-Enlightenment world, especially since the 1700s. The Christian church has carried on as though it can marginalize the supernatural and signs and wonders. And we'll get back to that. We'll talk about that more. But pay attention now. Number 1, signs and wonders are accompanying the church. They're what Stephen's doing. They're what attract attention to him, and they're what get him in trouble. Now he's being accused by the Synagogue of the Freedmen. Number 2, pay attention to who this is, the Synagogue of the Freedmen. We don't actually know anything about them historically other than this reference in the Bible, as far as I can find out. The word freedman is libertone in Greek, from which we get liberty, or liberal. The Synagogue of the Freedmen refers to a group of Jewish people, obviously in several cities, which means they have different synagogues, they have different locations, so it's spread to some degree. And it's not clear what they were liberated from. I don't think this is a theological liberation. I don't think they mean to say that somehow they are liberated from some teaching, because they're very intent about keeping the traditions of Moses. These are conservatives. The threat that Stephen poses is that he's not conservative. He's not keeping to traditions. He's a threat to traditions. He's threatening the temple, and he's threatening the traditions of Moses. So this conservative group, which calls themselves the Freedmen, are not talking about a theological kind of liberality. They're probably talking about a political kind of liberality, that either they had been freed from some kind of governance, or they wanted to be freed from some kind of governance. And that one's probably the most likely. The Jewish people at the day were very intent about being freed from the rule of Rome. And so that's what they're hoping for. And so most likely the Synagogue of the Freedmen is in some way hoping for freedom from the Roman Empire, which means freedom from the impurities of outside nations. And so if Stephen is a threat to the traditions of Moses and the temple, he sounds like exactly what the Synagogue of the Freedmen probably stands against. Outside influences that would corrupt traditional Judaism. So that's who that is. So notice that. Number 3, notice that their means of accusing Stephen is slander. They frame him with false accusations. They point back to Jesus, who said, remember, he said, tear down this temple and I'll rebuild it again in 3 days. And that was considered a threat to the state. And he's tampering with the customs of Moses. So he's not holding to the conservative traditions. It's ironic that they're called the Synagogue of the Freedmen when they are anything but free. And they don't want other people to be free. They want other people to hold to tradition, and they themselves are locked into traditions. They're not really free in that way. And it's just kind of a funny irony of their name. This captures a teaching of Jesus. Jesus said it would go this way. Jesus says that you can't put new wine in an old wineskin. So back then, they didn't have wine bottling the way we do now. They would carry wine around in leather pouches. They'd put wine in a leather pouch. And as you know, wine, as it's fermenting, releases gases. And if you have an old leather pouch that's a little bit hardened from age, and you put new wine in it that's still releasing gases, those gases will expand inside the leather pouch. It's kind of a corked leather pouch, a closed leather pouch, and it'll expand until it bursts. If you've ever had a fruit smoothie that has stayed in the back of the refrigerator too long, you know what this looks like. I used to work in a convenience store when I was in college, and if we pulled smoothies out of the refrigerator and they had gone from having sort of a square bottle to being perfectly round, we know that the gases in there had expanded too much and it was spoiled. It was no longer good. Well, that's what was happening in these leather pouches. The wine would release gases, it would expand, and then sometimes it could burst an old wineskin. So Jesus says you can't put new wine in an old wineskin. You have to put new wine in a new wineskin that's still flexible, that can still handle the expansion. And Jesus, by that teaching, was using a metaphor. He says you can't put new teaching in old thinkers. You can't teach an old dog new tricks, is the modern idiom. If you try to take a new teaching and put it in people who are entrenched in one way of seeing the world, entrenched in their paradigm, they cannot take to new teachings. And so Jesus shows up on the scene teaching that God was doing a new thing. God had come to the earth and was forgiving sins, and through the cross would forgive sins, and was calling people to himself. The traditionalists would not handle that, could not handle that, wouldn't put up with it. God can't become a human being. That was not within their paradigm. And so they would betray and crucify God in human form. And so the same thing is happening here now. They're framing Stephen because he is preaching a new way. The Jewish people were teaching, the Jewish Christians were teaching that their Messiah had come and that he had empowered believers to work miracles and preach good news to the poor. And that was just too radical for the day. And so the Synagogue of the Freedmen, who are not really free, grab hold of Stephen and make up accusations against him. And so then pay attention, number 4 in the next chapter, in Acts chapter 7, we get to Stephen's last speech. The question to Stephen is, are these charges true? Right? You've been accused of threatening the traditions of Moses and threatening the temple. Are these charges true? If you read Acts chapter 7, you might be bored by it. If you don't know the Hebrew Scriptures, you're going to be confused by it. So that's probably where we begin. If you don't know the Hebrew Bible and you're just new to the reading of the New Testament, Stephen will go through this long history narrative. And if you don't know the stories, you might look at it and go, why is he telling me all of this? If you do know the Hebrew stories, you might look at this and go, why is he summarizing all this? This is a boring history class. It's all true, but who cares? Like, why is he going through this history lesson? Here's what Stephen is doing in Acts chapter 7. They're accusing Stephen of perverting doctrine. And so what Stephen does is says, look, I believe in exactly the same history that you do. I believe in the teachings of the Hebrew Scriptures. I believe in the Jewish faith, just like you do. Watch. And then he goes back to the book of Genesis, and he tells the story of Abraham, and he tells the story of Isaac, and he tells the story of Jacob, and he tells the story of Joseph. He just recounts what's in the book of Genesis. Then he talks about how the Hebrew people ended up in slavery in Egypt, in the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible. And he says God raised up Moses, and actually gets very specifically into the details of Moses' childhood. God raised up Moses, and Moses went to the Pharaoh and worked signs and wonders, it says, right? Did miracles in the presence of the Pharaoh, which would have been the great plagues, and then led people out through the Red Sea. In the wilderness, Stephen continues, telling the same story that everybody knows because it's in Genesis and Exodus. They went out, and the Hebrew people, believing that Moses had disappeared, when Moses went up the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments, believing that Moses had disappeared, they made an idol out of gold. And it was an idol of a calf. Because back in Egypt, they worshipped a bull god named Apis. And whenever they needed a new pharaoh, they went to Apis to say, where's the new leader? And so Moses is up the mountain in the clouds for 40 days, and so the Hebrews who have escaped slavery go, well, I guess we better worship Apis and ask him who our next leader is supposed to be. So Stephen walks us through what is conservative traditional doctrine that all Jewish people would have agreed on. The reason he's doing that is because they're saying, hey, you're perverting our faith. And he's saying, no, look, I share the same faith with you. I share the faith of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. We're all on the same page. And now Stephen, at the end of chapter 7, does something that's radical and offensive. This is going to seal the deal for them and for him. Acts chapter 7, verse 51. And I didn't read the whole of chapter 7 because it is that long. We're in verse 51 now. But I want to read this little section at the end of chapter 7, starting at verse 51. Stephen says to his accusers, you stiff-necked people, which means stubborn, you stubborn people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. Circumcision was the Jewish rite of passage that said that you were part of the Jewish family and the Jewish faith. When he says your hearts are uncircumcised, it means you don't really believe in your heart. You're not truly Jewish. When he says your ears are uncircumcised, he means your ears cannot hear the truth, right? Your ears and your hearts, that part of you which should be receptive to God is still outside the faith. Your hearts and your ears are still uncircumcised. You are just like your ancestors. Now he's going to go back to the Hebrews worshiping the false idol of a calf out in the desert. You're just like your ancestors. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? In the Hebrew Scriptures, the prophets were often rejected by the people. The priests would say that the prophet's message was false. So a prophet would show up actually hearing the voice of God and say, God says we need to go this way instead of that way. And the priests, who just wanted traditions, who just wanted everything to stay the same, would say, no, the prophet's lying, the prophet's false, we should kill the prophet. And many of the prophets were driven into exile or killed in the Hebrew Scriptures. So Stephen is saying that that's who your ancestors are. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one, because the Hebrew Scriptures predict a coming Messiah. And now you have betrayed and murdered him, you who have received the law that was given through the angels but have not obeyed it. This is a sure way to get yourself killed, right? Stephen looks at his accusers and says, I'll tell you how good my theology is. And then he goes back into the stories of the Hebrew Scriptures, the foundational stories, and says, look, I'm on the side of all of our heroes, and you're on the side of the ones who worshiped the golden calf. You're on the side of the ones who killed the prophets. You're on the ones of the side who could not hear God's Spirit. That's who you are. That's who your ancestors were, and that's who you are today. And that will pretty much seal the deal. At that point, they will grab Stephen and take him out and stone him to death. Because in the teachings of their law, if you were perverting the Jewish faith, you deserved the death penalty. And you were a threat to the state, you were a threat to the sanctity of the nation, you were a threat to the faith, and so the death penalty was what you got, death by stoning, throwing rocks at them. So they take him out and they stone him to death. And Stephen here, at the end of his life, quotes the words of his Messiah, some of the last words of Jesus. He says, Lord, receive my spirit, just as Jesus had said on the cross. And then he says, do not hold this sin against them. And so his last words are words of forgiveness for the people who are killing him, just as Jesus on the cross said, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. And that's how Stephen's story came to a close. Sort of a beautiful and powerful last few words from the man who would now and forever after be remembered as the first martyr for the Christian faith. He was chosen because he was full of wisdom and the Holy Spirit to care for the widows who needed to receive food distribution. Remember, he was one of the ones just a chapter ago who was early, chapter 6, was chosen to care for those who are in need. So the disciples saw something in him. They saw him as a good man and a holy man, a man who was gifted by God. They chose him to be a leader in the church, and he, at the end, because of the way the Holy Spirit was pouring through him, he got all kinds of negative attention from people who saw the Christian faith as a threat, and he would die as the first martyr of the Christian faith. And that is the story of Stephen. Okay, let's pause on that for a minute. Let's talk about why Christianity is offensive, not only back then, but in the modern world. Not everybody realizes this because the U.S. media does not cover this, but Christians are as persecuted in the world today as they ever have been in history. And there are places all over the world where it's illegal to convert to Christianity. Muslim nations often prohibit it. Communist nations are averse to it. Certain countries have been known to go in and just tear down churches when they got too big or too popular. Certain countries monitor the behavior of churches and monitor the leaders of churches. And it's not, in some countries it's actually very likely that if someone takes a role in the leadership of the church that they may be arrested and imprisoned and even killed. And that's 2020. That's our world today. Yeah, we don't hear a lot of that covered in the news, but that is standard in certain parts of the world today. Here's why Christianity, I think, is so offensive in the world today. Three things. There are three reasons why I think Christianity is offensive and will always remain offensive. There are more than three, but here are the three main ones. One, it teaches that there's only one God, and that God is known in Jesus of Nazareth. And so that's a threat. That's a threat to three different bodies. One, it's a threat to polytheists, people who believe that there are lots of gods. And polytheists come in two forms. There are polytheists who, like the Romans, have a pantheon of gods, or modern Hindus in India, they believe in there are lots of different gods. And India today has driven a lot of Christian organizations out of the country. The current government of India has persecuted and driven out Christians. And part of it is it's a threat to polytheism. And India, with its polytheistic religion, sees Christianity as a threat, because Christianity teaches there's only one God who we know in Jesus of Nazareth, and all the other gods are false gods. So that's a threat to polytheism, to the belief in many gods. But there's another kind of polytheism which doesn't actually necessarily believe in gods, but it believes in tolerance. It believes that whatever people want to believe in, whatever people want to worship, they should be allowed to. And Christianity saying it's the one, or it's the right one, is terrible. It's wrong. And so modern liberal ideology would say that tolerance is the core of all virtues, and it doesn't matter which God you worship, but you can't tell other people that their gods are wrong. So you don't actually have to be a polytheist. You don't have to believe in a lot of gods to hold this position. You just may think that everybody should be able to believe whatever they want, and nobody should be able to claim that they're right. It's not exactly polytheism, but it supports polytheism. And it's because it makes tolerance the premier of all virtues. I like what G.K. Chesterton said about this 100 years ago. He says, tolerance is the virtue when you have no other virtues. If tolerance is the virtue above all else, it means you actually don't have virtues. It's the virtue you hold on to when you don't have any. And that's a kind of polyism that's threatened by the clarity of Christianity. So polytheism is one group that's threatened by the idea that there's only one God. The second group that's threatened by the idea that there's only one God is any other religion. It doesn't have to be polytheistic. Islam is threatened by Christianity, because Christianity says that Jesus was God, he died on the cross, and he rose from the dead. The Quran says Jesus was not God, he did not die on the cross, someone else did, and the disciples got confused, and obviously he didn't rise from the dead. And so for Islam, it's not polytheist, it's monotheist. They only believe there's one God, but they believe that that God is not Jesus. So Christianity is a threat to religions like that. Thirdly, Christianity is a threat to atheists. And I don't mean the run-of-the-mill college sophomore who's just kind of angry and wants to scoff at God. I mean specifically the communist governments of the world that have held that religion, per Karl Marx, religion is the opiate of the masses. It's just used to control people, and the world would be better off if religion were dismissed entirely. I believe there are only 5 communist countries left in the world, but it is hard to practice Christianity in some of those contexts. And in some of them, they do knock down churches or prohibit conversion to Christianity. And so those are 3 groups who are riled up at the idea that there's only one God, which Christianity has always claimed and always will claim. You can't get away from that. Second reason Christianity is offensive is that God demands loyalty above all else. In Christianity, God is either first in your life, or you might as well not bother with it. There are going to be no lukewarm Christians in heaven. If God's just an afterthought, that's not a saving faith. That's not a faith that will make you right before God. And the idea that God is first above all else is a threat not just to our apathy, but it's a threat to anybody else who wants authority over us. In families where a child converts to Christianity, the parents may be threatened by that because the child now believes there's another authority that has greater power than their parents. So a lot of governments in the world are threatened by Christianity because Christians swear an allegiance to a God whose values or viewpoint might rival the government's. So Christianity is always going to be a threat to those who want to be in power. So secondly, God demands loyalty above all else. That's the second reason Christianity is always going to be offensive. And thirdly and finally, Christianity is offensive and is always going to be offensive because God's commandments create moral obligation and consequently feelings of guilt. I've met people who would not convert to Christianity or didn't want to hear about it because they realized they would have to change their lifestyle. In fact, a famous philosopher, I believe it was one of the Huxleys, I believe it was Aldous Huxley, basically said he hoped Christianity was not true because he realized he would have to stop sleeping with his girlfriend. And that's not an uncommon viewpoint in a good cross-section of the world today. That I realize if Jesus is true, that's going to change my life in ways that seem prohibitive of the things I want to do, and I don't want a part of that. And I don't want to feel guilty for what I do. And so, so thirdly, Christianity is always going to be offensive because it comes with moral obligation. Let me give you 4 reasons why Christianity should not be offensive, though. Even if you're not a Christian, here are 4 reasons why Christianity should not be offensive. 1, Christianity teaches that love is the way to live. Love is what life is all about. Christianity is explicitly non-violent. In the teachings of Jesus, he says, love your neighbor, love your enemy, love lepers, love Samaritans, love prostitutes and tax collectors. Love is the way to live. If someone wrongs you, the Bible teaches, don't go get them back. Don't get revenge on them. You are not entitled to revenge if you are a follower of Jesus. You can't go around gossiping about people that you don't like if you're a follower of Jesus. That's a form of revenge. You can't do that. You are called to love your enemies. And Jesus says if somebody hits you on the one cheek, turn the other cheek to them as well. Don't fight back. If someone steals your shirt from you, give them your coat as well. Don't go try to get it back. Christianity shouldn't be offensive because it teaches that love is the way to live. I think Christians have often failed at that, which makes people very suspicious of Christianity. But the teachings of Jesus at their core, and the teachings of the New Testament at their core, teach that love is the way to live. So that should not be offensive. That should be the safest of all possible worldviews. Secondly, Christianity invites, it doesn't coerce. So anytime Christianity has manipulated people with guilt or tried to force people to believe or shamed people for not believing, Christianity has done wrong. Christianity invites people to follow Jesus. It never coerces and never forces. Thirdly, freedom is at the heart of the Scriptures. So in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the second book of the Old Testament is Exodus. And it's only the second book of all the 39 books in the Old Testament, but it's really the center of the Hebrew Scriptures. Exodus is the middle part, the turning point of the Scriptures. It identifies God as the one who wants his people to be free. Forever after, when God identifies himself, he says, remember, I'm the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That's who I am. I am the God who wants you to be free, who loves you enough not to leave you trapped in slavery. That's who God is. And so Christianity teaches, it ultimately teaches freedom. Freedom is at the heart of the Scriptures. And everyone should be freed by that. Christianity is not trying to control people. It's actually trying to set people free. And fourthly, love and moral values make relationships better, and they make people's personal health better. I mean, just in a practical way. If you're seeking to be loving, if you're seeking not to be greedy, if you're seeking not to hurt other people, your relationships are going to be better, and your personal health's going to be better. That Christianity at its heart should make us all better people. Often, people only partially follow the teachings of Jesus, or they say they do when they don't, and that compromises Christianity's power to make us better people. But at its heart, Christianity should make us better when we follow after Jesus. And so that's 4 reasons why, honestly, I don't think Christianity should ever be a threat to anyone. It doesn't intend to threaten anyone. But at the end of the day, truth is threatening, and there are those who will always just reject it. Okay, let's get to Acts chapter 8, and we're going to look at Saul, Simon, and Philip. Saul we're only going to look at briefly because he only shows up here as a cameo. Saul will be the main character of the book of Acts, and in the next chapter he's going to convert to Christianity and change his name to Paul. But here we see that in chapter 7, verse 58, when they're about to stone Stephen, they put their jackets down in front of Saul. Right? Saul's the coat clerk as they go to stone Stephen. So essentially, Saul's ruling over it. Saul seems to be governing it, and he sends them out to do their dirty work. And then in chapter 8, verse 1, it says Saul approved of all this. Right? Saul approved of Stephen's being killed. So here's what happens. Saul shows up, and it is the beginning, it's the initiation of the persecution of Christianity. Right? Stephen's the first martyr. Saul is the first murderer. And what happens is the Christian church has grown, we know, at least to 5,000 people at this point. And it says here in chapter 8, verse 1, all of them were then scattered, because of Saul, were then scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. So this is actually powerful. Pay attention to this. What happens is terrible. What happens to Stephen is terrible. To be a Christian living in that day must have been so frightening, because you see these signs and wonders that are going on. It's amazing. It's powerful. What's going on in the community is powerful. But you know that the traditional Jewish believers see you as a threat. It must have been frightening. And then when persecution breaks out, you're still a minority group. And so to scatter, to run away from this probably Jerusalem right in the middle where everything began, to then scatter throughout the country must have been a frightening thing. But as the consequence, what happened is it's then spread, the message is then spread throughout the country. They may have been running away, but they were carrying with them seeds to plant. It's essentially like that Christian theologian who said, trying to destroy Christianity by killing Christ is like trying to destroy a dandelion seed head by blowing on it, right? And the dandelion seeds spread all over the place on the wind and then grow more dandelions. Well, same with the early Christians. Trying to destroy Christianity by persecuting the early Christians was like trying to spread yeast out so it didn't do too much damage by sitting in one spot. Well, yeast being spread out does more damage, right? It has more effect. And that's what happens with the early Christians. They spread all over the place, and that's how the early Christian message went from just spreading in Jerusalem to spreading throughout the country. It's interesting to think about that today, right now, because of what you and I are doing right here and right now. What if the coronavirus spread the church? Instead of closing it, what if it spread it? What if this picture this 20 years from now, when historians look back on what happened in the church, what you and I are doing right now is historical. The church is moving online in powerful new ways. We were already there. We were already dabbling in online worship and online communication, but it's a whole new ballgame now. People are doing it more often and more effectively. And it's just going to get better. Our tools are going to get better. Our frequency of using online communication is going to get better. Old pastors who are avoiding this are now going to be immersed in it. And I bet years from now, when historians look back, they'll talk about this as a pivot of the spread of the church, where suddenly the church spread in a powerful way online, even more so than it had already. So what if this is like the persecution of the early church, where instead of slowing us down, it spreads us out. It spreads us further. I think that might actually be what's going on right now as you and I do this. But that's kind of cool. And in the end, what this says, again, about Christianity is that going to seed, like a plant that gets old and produces seeds and then dies, going to seed is what we're made for. We're made to go to seed. We're made to spread. Death is the end game for all of us. That's where we're all going. In this life, spread good seeds, right? Spread the word of Jesus. That's what we're here for, to plant good things. Okay, so now we get to Simon the sorcerer. And I want to talk about this a little bit because it's kind of interesting, kind of quirky. Oh, I got to get Simon and Philip in here. Okay, we're going to get them both in. Simon is called a sorcerer or a magician. Don't let that conjure up in your mind images of David Blaine, like little street magicians doing card tricks. This is a guy who's calling on the powers of hell to do tricks to empower himself. Right? What he's actually dabbling in is evil. And don't write this off as a mistaken understanding of the ancient world. This has gone on throughout the history of the world, and in a post-Enlightenment context, we're often dismissive of this. But I want to look a little bit at the history of this. Right now, if you go out to the beach communities, you go out to Venice Beach, right, and walk around out there, you'll see psychic readers, you'll see tarot card readers, people who will use Ouija boards to tell you about your life. And a lot of people just view that as kind of a game, something fun and silly. I think we're underestimating reality. I think we're underestimating what's really going on in the world. And I'll tell you from personal experience, something I saw one time, and you can make of this what you want to. I got called over to visit someone's house because they said weird things were going on in the house. And when I visited, there was a grandmother living in the house who met us at the door, and she had a brain tumor and couldn't make full sentences in English. What came out sounded like gibberish. It sounded like part of one sentence and part of another sentence. So I could understand how the family would be stressed by that. They would be saddened by that. It seemed a little disturbing. And so I sat down with the family and I thought, well, there might not be really scary things going on in the house. They may just be in a stressful place. So I said, tell me about what's going on. And two of them said, well, we had nightmares on the same night. And I said, yeah, well, that's stress is what that is. And they said, yeah, but it was the same nightmare. I said, well, maybe. And we talked for a little while longer. I think we talked for 20 minutes, and I couldn't really land on anything that sounded truly supernatural. It just sounded like they were in a sad, stressful situation. And then I said, is there anything else you want to talk to me about? And they said, oh, well, there was at one time that we saw an apparition of a little boy running down the hallway. And I was like, how did you not lead with that? How did you not start there? Okay, so that was going on in the house, and I realized we're going to be praying about something totally different. This isn't just prayers for healing and prayers for peace. We're going to be praying against dark things. And so we prayed in different rooms of the house, and I've done this before. Nothing happens. The lights don't flash. There's no smoke or anything. There's no voices. We just go around and pray for different rooms of the house. And for everybody I prayed for before, that's the end of it. They never see or hear anything again. And we're in a back room in the house with the family. We're just praying in different rooms. And for some reason, I had this inclination. I've never asked this of anybody before or since, so this isn't something I think about much. And I don't know what prompted me to ask it, because it's not something I would naturally think about, right? So maybe the Holy Spirit prompted me to think about this. But I looked at the dad of the house and I said, do you have a Ouija board around here? And I didn't have any great inhibitions about Ouija boards. I thought it was just kind of silly at the time. And he goes, no, we don't have anything like that. And I said, oh, okay, never mind. Must be in my imagination. And he goes, but I did used to work in a factory that made thousands of those. I thought, oh gosh, okay, wow. And I thought to ask that. And I've never asked that of anybody before. I don't go around in circles about those things. But I'm aware that there are good and bad forces in the world. And this is the way Christians think about this. There are five steps here to pay attention to. One, God makes different species, right? God makes human beings, God makes animals, and God makes angels, right? And you can't follow the storyline of the Bible and think that angels aren't real. That's how the Bible describes it. If you're going to have a biblical worldview, it's just another species of thing that you can't see, usually, but they're there. And human beings can choose to follow God or reject God, right? We all know that. Some of us choose to follow Jesus, some of us choose to say no and run in the other direction. Angels are the same way. And the Bible says some angels serve God and some angels fought against and rejected God. And Satan is one of those fallen angels who rejected God. Animals, I don't think, get the same choice. Like, I look at my two dogs, Ben and Charlie. Ben and Charlie could choose nothing but good. That's just how they are. They're just nice and they're happy and they choose good. Cats, no, cats can't choose either. No, animals don't get to choose. Animals don't choose good or bad. But people and angels can. So then, people can choose good and bad. There is spiritual power in the world that can be used by either team. And you see this throughout the Bible. Like, we're reading the book of Acts and talking about signs and wonders that followed the apostles, but it runs throughout the whole Bible. Moses went and parted the Red Sea, and the people passed through the Red Sea. Elijah parted a river and walked through it. Elijah called fire down from heaven and set an altar on fire. Elijah stopped the rain, right? The supernatural was a power given to believers. In Jesus' ministry, he heals people everywhere and raises the dead. And then in the early Christian church, people were working miracles as well. Well, the same thing's true on the other side. People can use spiritual power for dark things. And that runs through the scriptures as well. In ancient Egypt, Pharaoh in his court had magicians who could do some of the same things that they saw Moses doing. And it's not card tricks. It's calling on darker powers to actually move the world in supernatural ways. In 1 Samuel 28, there's a king whose name is Saul, after whom our Saul is named. King Saul, who goes to a medium or a witch to summon the spirit of Samuel from the dead and to commune with the dead, which is condemned by the Bible. But Saul, who's a bad king, goes and does that. And here in the New Testament, we come across Simon the sorcerer, who is somebody who is using what is really demonic powers to show how powerful he can be, to draw attention to himself. So that's who this is, and that's what's going on. So God made different species. Species can rebel against God, can choose to follow or rebel, and there's spiritual power that either group can use. Just to extend this one step further, number 4, there are actually objects in the Bible that are empowered for good and bad. And so, like the Ark of the Covenant is said to have power in it. One time a guy touched it and he died, and it went before Israel's army everywhere. Aaron's staff that he carried with him was said to have power in it. Elijah carried a cloak that when he parted the river, he hit it with a cloak, and the river parted. And then he would give the cloak to his apprentice, Elisha, who would do the same thing with it. So there are actually objects in the Bible that are empowered, which is why in Acts we see people sitting on the streets hoping to just be touched by the shadow of Peter. We see a woman who touches the hem of Jesus' cloak and is healed. Right? There's some way in which objects are empowered. Same thing is true on the dark side. There are idols like golden calves, which the people worship and in some way or another seem to have power at least over them. Okay, so fifth thing to think about as we look at Simon. One, God made different species. Two, species can rebel. Three, there's actual spiritual power that people can use for good or bad, including even objects that can be empowered, which is why we see that in the book of Acts. Now, fifthly, let's think about what this does to our mindset. A lot of people hear this and think this is kind of crazy. It's crazy or it's superstitious nonsense. That's because we live in a post-Enlightenment world, right? Several hundred years after the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment traces itself back to an inclination from some European philosophers to say, religious people are dangerous. They get in wars, they kill each other, they are corrupt, they don't seem to follow the teachings of their leader, Jesus. And so we need to base society and government on something other than religion and scriptures. We should base it on human reason. And look at the amazing things we can do with the human mind, right? Empirical science developed out of this emphasis on using the mind to study the world without God being part of the picture, or just God being in the distant background. One of the important Enlightenment thinkers was a guy named David Hume, who lived from 1711 to 1776. And Hume, in his writings, ridicules religion. I don't think he ever came out and said he was an atheist, and I've even heard some people say he wasn't, but I think clearly he was. He makes a case against miracles ever actually happening, so much so that he says, even if you think you hear a reliable story of a miracle from history, you shouldn't believe it because you haven't seen one, and your first-person experience is more reliable than a testimony from history. And with many other arguments, he makes a case against miracles and against the supernatural, and consequently, he's really arguing against God. So that was David Hume, who died in 1776. One of the people who read David Hume was Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, his viewpoint was that there might be a God up there in heaven that started everything off and that undergirds our morality, but he's not involved in this world in any real way. And so Jefferson released a copy of the Bible that's now called the Jefferson Bible. You can buy it online. And he went through the Bible and he removed all the supernatural stories. It's a much shorter version than the original. Right? The Jefferson Bible is a tiny Bible because he removed all the supernatural because he said that was just superstitious. When you and I in the world today hear stories about magic or witchcraft or miracles or signs and wonders, many people are immediately suspicious and doubtful. That comes through a line of thinking called deism, the belief that there's a God up there who doesn't do anything in the world, which we can trace back to the early founders of our country, who got it from European philosophers who were actually arguing from a place of atheism. The belief that signs and wonders don't happen today has its roots in an atheistic, rationalistic worldview. And at some point, you're really going to have to decide where you stand on that. Either you have a biblical worldview and these things are real, or you have a worldview that traces itself back to atheism and these things are not. And ultimately, if that's where you land, if you land on a belief that there's a God up there somewhere but he's not involved in this world, I think what you're going to gravitate towards over the course of your life is atheism rather than belief. So there you go. That's how to think about Simon the sorcerer, who tried to learn what the disciples were doing and ultimately ended up converting to Christianity because of the power he saw in them. Finally, let's get to the last one here. Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. So you can read the story in Acts. What happens is Philip is prompted by the Holy Spirit to go run alongside a chariot in which there is an Ethiopian eunuch who's reading the book of Isaiah. What Philip hears here is referred to in 1 Corinthians 12 as a word of knowledge. When God speaks to you and gives you a piece of knowledge that you couldn't have in any natural way, that's a word of knowledge. Or maybe we could just call this a prompting of the Holy Spirit. Just go run alongside that chariot. And Philip goes and finds this eunuch who's reading the book of Isaiah, the scroll of Isaiah. And eunuchs were well known in the ancient world, often in royal courts, and this is around the world. Eunuchs were made servants of the emperors and often served in the court. And so as a result, they often had a great influence over ruling parties. They were the ones who would cut their hair and bathe them and cook their food. They were house servants for people of influence. And so the eunuchs often had great influence. And it says here in Acts that this eunuch was a person of some influence and who knew influential people. He's a servant of the Kandake, which is the sister of the king, most likely. And most likely, the one that he served under was Amentatare, who was the Kandake in Ethiopia at this time. Just a little helpful, useless trivia from the day. The Spirit tells Philip to go alongside this eunuch. So what's significant about this is what this says about the influence of the church now. The church is reaching outside of the Jewish world and even outside the Greek world, right? It's reaching further. It's reaching back into a nation which historically was a threat to the Jewish people. This is down south of Egypt, right? It's reaching down past and nearby the lands of Egypt, which is pretty significant. It's reaching to a class that was often ruled outsiders by the Jewish people. If you had any kind of blemish on your body, a disability of any kind, you were not allowed into the inner circles of the Jewish temple. And so eunuchs would not have been allowed inside the temple. They were considered outsiders, somehow limited or less worthy. The Christian faith is now spreading to them as well. And so there's this supernatural, miraculous moment where this Ethiopian is open enough to the pursuit of God that he's somehow come across the Hebrew scriptures and is reading them. And God uses that moment to say, well, if you're that open to me, let me show you the truth. And he sends Philip running in to interpret the scroll of Isaiah as it applies to Jesus, as it points to Jesus. And then they stop and the Ethiopian is baptized. And it makes such a powerful statement about how the early Christian church was then spreading. It was no longer just in Jerusalem, it was now all over the country, and it was beyond the walls of the country now. It was even way down, if you look at a map where Ethiopia is over next to Saudi Arabia on the eastern coast, it's spreading far and wide. And that's a great promise about what the Christian church did and what it's supposed to do today. So there you go. That's got us caught up to now. Next week we're going to look at the conversion of Saul, how Saul became a Christian and changed his name to Paul, and all the rest of the book of Acts is going to follow him. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining me. This is fun for me to poke through. I learn new things every time I read the Bible. I hope you do too. God bless you, and I'll see you again soon.